Hello and welcome back to Audio Encyclopedia. Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer and unpack the, well, incredibly complex world of global government structures. For years, there's been this massive demand to break down exactly how different nations are ruled. And today, that's exactly what we're going to do. We are examining 11 distinct political systems.
It's so wonderful to have you joining us once again. Our main goal today is to really cut through all that confusing political jargon and clearly map out how power, resources, and honestly human lives are managed under these various ideologies. We'll be looking at the whole spectrum, everything from systems with absolutely zero government all the way to those that literally control every single breath their citizens take.
Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Chaos and shared power. 2. Rule by the few. 3. The economic divide. 4. Systems of extreme control. And finally, number 5, the final verdict.
Section 1. Chaos and shared power. From nothing to nuance.
Let's start at the absolute baseline of zero government, which is anarchy. Now, when we talk about anarchy, we aren't just talking about a temporary breakdown of order. Anarchy actually refers to a territory where there's absolutely no functioning, legitimate government left. It's typically characterized by a devastating, ongoing civil war where citizens are just endlessly fighting whatever remnants of the state exist, and the conflict simply doesn't end. Fortunately for us, at this very moment, no recognized country in the world is classified as a complete anarchy.
But recent history does give us some incredibly stark examples of what happens when a central government just completely collapses. For instance, when ISIS occupied large portions of Syria, that territory fell into complete anarchy. Similarly, if you look at Libya immediately following the fall of Gaddafi, it descended into an anarchic state too, though, to be fair, it has since begun to stabilize. These examples serve as a really sobering reminder of the chaos that ensues when centralized authority is just gone.
So moving from absolute chaos to structured shared power, we arrive at the federal system. The United States is obviously the primary example here. In a federal government, you have a powerful central authority. They control the military, national forces, things like that. But power is shared. Individual states have their own governments and can actually create their own laws without needing a permission slip from the central government. But they still got to adhere to certain national standards. Take New Mexico, for example. It has a very large Hispanic population, right? Yet, the people don't demand Spanish as the official language because they know it would sever their connectivity with the rest of the country.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that under a federal system, local autonomy is very real. For example, in states like Colorado and California, certain substances like marijuana can be purchased freely and legally. But cross an invisible state line into a state like Nevada or Florida, historically speaking or depending on specific local statutes, and that exact same action could literally land you in jail? It's wild, right? Just crossing an invisible line can completely change what is legally permissible. It really highlights the unique balance of a federal structure.
Section 2. Rule by the few. Monarchs and oligarchs. Let's get into it.
First up in this group is the monarchy. In an absolute monarchy, the decision-making process is entirely top-down. The country is controlled by a king or queen who acts as the ultimate head of state. There's no sharing of supreme power here. The royal figure has the absolute final say on all manners of state, law, and execution. A prime modern example of this structure in action is Saudi Arabia.
Now, by contrast, an oligarchy distributes that immense power slightly wider, but it still keeps it strictly away from the general public. It places an entire nation's trajectory into the hands of a small, influential elite. This group is usually made up of the ultra-wealthy, religious leaders, or maybe high-ranking military officers. The absolute most prominent current example of an oligarchy is Russia. And Ukraine is historically cited as the second largest, which is actually a structural legacy inherited from the days of the Soviet Union.
Section 3. The economic divide. Capitalism, Communism, and Socialism.
It's honestly fascinating to break down these three major economic systems side by side. Okay, so in capitalism, you have extreme freedom in private business. This creates a very high incentive to work and invent, but it does result in an unequal distribution of wealth, meaning, you have very rich and very poor people. Communism takes the exact opposite approach. The state owns absolutely everything: farms, schools, hospitals, even your cars. Because the state provides a basic life regardless of your effort, the incentive to work hard basically drops to zero. And while everyone is equal, it means there are no wealthy citizens. Now, socialism sits somewhere in the middle. It utilizes large state-owned companies rather than full private enterprise, and it provides a basic income for everyone whether they work or not. But again, this severely lowers the incentive to innovate, leaving everyone somewhat equally struggling.
Let's look a little bit closer at capitalism for a second. The reality of a capitalist system, like we have in the United States, is that it creates massive economic growth and military superpowers. Why? purely because everyone is driven to succeed, invent, and make money. However, this system strictly ties a person's access to resources directly to their wealth. There are no inherently free universities, hospitals, or dentists. If you want these services, you've got to purchase private insurance. Bottom line, if you don't work, you simply do not receive free amenities.
On the complete other end of the spectrum, we have communism. And while communism sounds beautiful on paper, a classless society where everyone is completely equal, the historical implementation tells a pretty grim story. Historical records show that over a 70-year period, the communist government of the Soviet Union signed death warrants for over 100 million of its own people just to enforce and maintain this ideology. It turns out when there is no natural incentive to work, compliance has to be forced.
And this perfectly highlights the stark difference between theory and practice. Take Marxism, for example. It's Karl Marx's purely theoretical, extreme left-wing idea of a perfectly equal, classless society. It sounds wonderful in a textbook. But when you look at realized communism under Lenin, who took Marx's ideas and applied them to the USSR, it proved that when human nature and absolute power are added to the equation, the ideology inevitably devolves into ruthless dictatorship. We've seen this historical pattern repeat in the Soviet Union, Mao's China, and under Kim Jong-un in North Korea.
Yet, there is a totally fascinating modern exception to this rule, and that's China. Today, China is the largest communist state in the world, but it broke the traditional communist mold to survive. It actually allowed capitalist-style private business, manufacturing, and wealth generation, which caused its economy to just absolutely skyrocket. However, this extreme economic freedom, it's kind of an illusion. It remains strictly under the watchful eye of the government. To truly gain wealth and advance your business, you must be a member of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. You just cannot succeed independently of the state's oversight.
Moving on to Section 4, Systems of Extreme Control. When we look at political extremes, a pretty profound paradox emerges. On one hand, you have Marxism, an extreme left-wing ideology seeking to forcibly erase class entirely. Then on the other hand, you have Fascism, an extreme right-wing ideology, where a dictator forces their personal, nationalistic vision onto the country at all costs. The two most infamous examples of fascism are, of course, Nazi Germany and Benito Mussolini's Italy during World War II. But here's the crazy part. Despite being on complete opposite ends of the political spectrum, both ideologies historically end up looking remarkably similar. They both rely on absolute, uncompromising control over the population. Imperialism takes that desire for extreme control and just turns it outward. An imperialist government is fundamentally focused on expanding its borders to colonize other nations and exploit their populations and natural resources. Historically, this has been primarily seen in Africa, with some really devastating examples being King Leopold II's brutal colonization of the Congo and the British colonization of South Africa. And now we arrive at totalitarianism. Now, it's super important to understand that totalitarianism is not an economic system. Rather, it is a blanket term for a terrifying method of rule. Think about it. A communist, socialist, fascist, or even a monarchical government can all be totalitarian. It defines a state that uses fear, terror, and absolute surveillance to force compliance and control every single aspect of its citizens' lives. Nazi Germany, the USSR, North Korea, and China are all prime historical and modern examples of totalitarian regimes.
To truly wrap your head around the suffocating reality of totalitarianism, just imagine being unable to leave your own city without getting permission from the government first. Seriously, think about that. This isn't fiction. These strict travel restrictions were heavily enforced during the Soviet era, where citizens were literally trapped in their own hometowns. And variations of this extreme internal control are still utilized to govern populations in places like China and North Korea today.
Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, the final verdict.
Now that you've seen the raw facts, the structural differences, and the real historical outcomes of these ideologies, from the boundless innovation but harsh realities of capitalism to the enforced equality and historical tragedies of communism, and the entire spectrum of control in between, I want to leave you with a question. Out of these 11 systems, which one do you believe holds the true key to a successful, thriving society? Think about that balance between freedom, equality, and order. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this leaves you with plenty to think about. Until next time.